The Japanese destroyer's searchlight swept across the water like the finger of death. Missing our bow by mere feet, we held our breath, engines cut to idle, drifting in the darkness off Vella Lavella. 23 American sailors pressed against the deck of PT-164, trying to become invisible. In the cargo holds of the 3 Japanese transports behind that destroyer, nearly 8,000 enemy soldiers sat unaware that their journey to reinforce Kolombangara was about to end in the black waters of the Solomon Sea. The date was July 20th, 1943, and in exactly 4 minutes we would unleash hell from the shadows. My hands gripped the twin .50 caliber mount so tightly my knuckles ached. Beside me, Ensign Robert Dutch Vanderberg whispered coordinates to our skipper, Lieutenant Commander Arthur M. Mac McPhersonson. The green phosphorescent glow of our compass was the only light we dared show. Behind us, hidden in the moon's shadow cast by Vella Lavella's volcanic peaks, PT-168 and PT-171 waited for our signal. We were America's secret weapons, and the Japanese Navy was about to discover why darkness was no longer their ally. My name is Chief Petty Officer Thomas Tom Harrigan, United States Navy Reserve, and I was one of the first to prove that small wooden boats could sink steel warships. People often ask me what it was like being part of the most closely guarded naval secret of 1943. The truth is, we were too busy trying not to die to think about making history. We only knew that if we failed tonight, those 8,000 Japanese soldiers would reach Kolombangara, where they would slaughter American boys trying to take that strategic airfield. Every torpedo we carried represented hundreds of American lives that might be saved. Every enemy transport we sent to the bottom meant parents back home who wouldn't receive that dreaded telegram from the War Department. To understand how 3 boats smaller than most private yachts could challenge the Imperial Japanese Navy at the height of its power, you need to understand what we were up against in the summer of 1943. The Japanese had turned night fighting into an art form. Since their victory at Savo Island the previous August, where they sank 4 Allied cruisers without losing a ship, they owned the darkness in the Solomon Islands. Their sailors trained for years in night combat, learning to fight without radar, using only keen eyesight, and practiced coordination. They called their nighttime supply runs the Tokyo Express, and we called them the Rat Run. Either way, they moved troops and supplies with near impunity once the sun went down. The American Navy had bigger ships, better radar, and more firepower. But we were losing the night war. Our admirals, trained in traditional battle line tactics, couldn't adapt quickly enough to this new kind of warfare. Our cruisers and destroyers were sitting ducks in the confined waters of the Solomons. We needed something different, something the Japanese wouldn't expect. That something was drifting silently in the darkness, 3 wooden boats carrying desperate men with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The Solomon Islands in the summer of 1943 were hell on earth, wrapped in tropical beauty. Crystal blue waters hid coral reefs that could gut a ship's hull. Lush green islands concealed Japanese artillery and machine gun nests. Every night, the Tokyo Express ran supplies and reinforcements down the slot, the narrow channel between the islands, and every night, American forces watched helplessly as enemy convoys passed unmolested through waters we supposedly controlled. The problem wasn't courage or firepower. The problem was that the Japanese had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of warfare while we were still thinking about fleet actions on the open ocean. Their destroyers were faster and more maneuverable than ours. Their crews could reload torpedoes in minutes, while ours took hours. Most importantly, they had perfected the art of night combat without radar, using binoculars, practiced coordination, and sheer audacity to dominate the darkness. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of South Pacific Forces, was tearing his hair out. Every night, Japanese supply runs meant more enemy soldiers, more ammunition, more food arriving at forward bases. Every successful convoy meant American forces would face stronger opposition when they tried to take the next island. The math was simple and brutal. If we couldn't stop the Tokyo Express, we couldn't win the Solomon campaign. And if we couldn't win the Solomons, we couldn't advance toward Japan. The conventional response would have been to send more cruisers and destroyers into night battles. But we'd already tried that at Savo Island, Cape Esperance, and Guadalcanal. The results were consistently catastrophic. Japanese long-lance torpedoes had a range of 20 miles and carried warheads twice as powerful as ours. Their gunners could fire salvos with devastating accuracy in pitch darkness. Our ships were being cut to pieces before they could even see what was shooting at them. Someone suggested using submarines, but they were too slow to intercept fast-moving convoys and too valuable to risk in shallow waters. Someone else proposed massive air attacks, but Japanese convoys ran at night, specifically to avoid our aircraft. The Army Air Corps couldn't hit moving targets in darkness, and our carrier planes needed daylight to operate effectively. We needed a weapon that could fight at night, move faster than Japanese destroyers, strike without warning, and disappear before enemy gunners could respond. We needed something that didn't exist in any Navy's inventory, something that violated every traditional concept of naval warfare. We needed the PT boat. The concept wasn't entirely new. The British had experimented with fast motor torpedo boats in World War I, and several European navies maintained small coastal attack craft. But American naval doctrine had always emphasized big ships and big guns. Destroyers were the smallest combat vessels considered viable, and even they were getting larger every year. The idea that a wooden boat the size of a fishing trawler could challenge steel warships seemed absurd to most senior officers. But desperation breeds innovation. And by 1943, we were desperate. The Navy authorized construction of patrol torpedo boats in secret boatyards from New Orleans to New York, and they asked for volunteers willing to crew experimental vessels with expected casualty rates over 50%. I volunteered because I was young and stupid and thought it sounded exciting. I had no idea I was signing up to revolutionize naval warfare. I first saw a PT boat in February 1943 at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron Training Center in Melville, Rhode Island. I was a destroyer sailor fresh from convoy duty in the North Atlantic when the Navy asked for volunteers for hazardous duty with experimental vessels. The recruiter wouldn't tell us what these vessels were, only that the casualty rate was expected to be over 50%. Out of 200 volunteers, they selected 40. I made the cut because I could navigate by stars and had small boat experience from growing up on Chesapeake Bay. The first time I stepped aboard PT 164, I thought the Navy had lost its mind. This wasn't a warship. It was a glorified speedboat with delusions of grandeur. The hull was wood, mahogany plywood, laminated in layers, not steel. The living quarters were so cramped that hot bunking wasn't just common, it was mandatory. There was no armor protection except for some sheet metal around the bridge. One good hit from anything larger than a rifle bullet, and we'd be matchsticks floating on the water. The specifications seemed designed by someone who'd never actually been in combat. 80 feet long and 20 feet wide. The PT boat displaced only 56 tons, fully loaded. For comparison, a destroyer displaced over 2,000 tons. We carried 4 Mark 13 torpedoes, each weighing 2,200 pounds and costing as much as a house back home. We had a 20mm Oerlikon cannon, 4 50-caliber machine guns, and enough ammunition for about 15 minutes of sustained combat. After that, we'd better be heading home or heading to the bottom. But the engines, those magnificent bastards, those were something special. 3 Packard 5M 2500 engines. Modified versions of the Liberty aircraft engine, each producing 1,500 horsepower. Together, they could push our wooden hull to speeds over 45 knots. Faster than any destroyer, faster than most torpedoes, faster than anything the Japanese could throw at us. Those engines were the reason PT boats could survive. Speed was our armor, acceleration our shield. The fuel capacity was 1,200 gallons, giving us a range of about 500 miles at cruising speed. But nobody cruised in a PT boat. We either idled quietly on patrol or ran flat out at maximum power. Fuel consumption at full throttle was roughly a gallon per mile, meaning we had maybe 4 hours of combat operations before we'd be dead in the water. The crew complement was 12 men. Skipper, executive officer, 2 quartermasters, 1 radioman, 1 radar operator, 2 motor machinist mates, 1 cook who doubled as a medic, and 3 gunners. 12 men who would live, fight, and possibly die together in a space smaller than most people's living rooms. There were no separate officer quarters, no enlisted mess, no privacy whatsoever. We ate together, slept in shifts, and shared a single head that barely functioned in rough seas. Commander James Wild Jim Patterson, who ran the training program, gathered us on the dock that first morning and delivered the most honest briefing I'd ever heard from a senior officer. He said these boats are fast, heavily armed, and completely expendable. So are you. The Japanese have better night vision, better torpedoes, and a decade more combat experience. Your only advantages are speed, surprise, and the fact that they won't expect wooden boats to attack steel warships. Use those advantages or die. There are no other options. That's when I realized what we'd volunteered for. We weren't joining the Navy. We were joining a suicide squadron with a 49% survival rate if we were lucky. The conventional Navy brass thought PT boats were floating coffins. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of amphibious forces in the Pacific, called them toys for reckless boys playing at war. Captain William Old Bill Henderson, a battleship commander who'd fought at Jutland in World War I, said wooden boats, attacking steel warships, violated every principle of naval warfare and predicted we'd all be dead within a month. They weren't entirely wrong. Early PT boat operations in the Philippines had been disasters. When the Japanese invaded in December 1941, the handful of PT boats stationed there were hastily organized into attack squadrons with minimal training. They attacked Japanese invasion forces with more courage than skill and paid a terrible price. Of the original squadron, fewer than half survived. The ones that did escape managed to evacuate General MacArthur from Corregidor, which made great publicity but did nothing to prove PT boats could actually fight effectively. The problem wasn't the boats themselves. The problem was that nobody knew how to use them properly. Traditional naval doctrine emphasized staying in formation, coordinating with other ships, and trading salvos until one side broke. PT boats couldn't do any of that. They were too small to absorb damage, too fast to maintain formation with conventional ships, and carried too few torpedoes to win extended engagements. But Lieutenant Commander Mac McPhersonson understood what the den-dawed admirals didn't. PT boats weren't meant to fight like conventional warships. We were maritime guerrillas, sea-going assassins who struck from ambush and vanished before the enemy could react. Mac had been at Pearl Harbor aboard the destroyer USS Shaw when the Japanese attacked, had fought at Midway, and volunteered for PT boats because, in his words, I'm tired of being a target. Time to become the hunter. He taught us to think like pirates rather than sailors. Forget formation steaming. Forget coordinated maneuvers. Forget everything the Naval Academy taught about honor and fair fighting. The Japanese expected us to follow rules and traditions. Our job was to shatter those expectations with violence and speed. Training at Melville was brutal and unforgiving. We practiced high-speed attacks until we could launch torpedoes accurately while bouncing across waves at 40 knots. We learned to navigate by sound and instinct when tropical squalls reduced visibility to zero. We ran night exercises where veteran instructors playing Japanese destroyers hunted us with searchlights and blank ammunition. The fear was real, even if the bullets weren't. Most importantly, we learned to operate as a unified crew, despite having no formal chain of command beyond skipper and executive officer. On a destroyer with 300 men, you had layers of officers and chiefs coordinating every action. On a PT boat with 12 men, everyone had to know everyone else's job. If the torpedo man got killed, someone else had to be able to arm and launch torpedoes. If the radio man got hit, someone else had to be able to call for help. Cross-training wasn't optional. It was survival. The psychological screening was just as important as tactical training. PT boat duty attracted a certain type of personality. Men who chafed under traditional military discipline, who preferred action over hierarchy, who'd rather die fighting than wait for orders. We were volunteers who'd signed up knowing we probably wouldn't survive the war. That knowledge created a unique bond. We trusted each other completely because we had no choice. By the time we completed training in May 1943, our crew had transformed from individual sailors into a single organism with 12 bodies and one purpose: sink Japanese ships or die trying. The admirals remained skeptical, but they were running out of options. We shipped out to the Solomon Islands with orders to prove PT boats could do more than evacuate generals. Everything about PT boats contradicted fundamental principles of naval warfare. And that's exactly why they worked. The Imperial Japanese Navy had studied American doctrine for decades. They knew our battleships, our cruisers, our carriers, our strategies. But they never imagined we'd send wooden speedboats armed with torpedoes to challenge their steel warships. The contradiction started with construction materials. Since the age of ironclads, warships had been built from metal. Steel provided armor protection, structural strength, and resistance to battle damage. Wood was for fishing boats and pleasure craft, not combat vessels. But mahogany plywood laminated in 3 layers created a hull that was lighter, faster, and surprisingly resilient. Small caliber bullets passed through without causing catastrophic damage. Even shell fragments that would have torn steel into deadly shrapnel often punched clean holes through wood that could be patched quickly. The size contradiction was equally dramatic. Naval wisdom held that bigger was better. More displacement meant more armor, more guns, more crew, more survivability. American destroyers were constantly growing larger because planners believed increased size improved combat effectiveness. At 56 tons displacement, we were smaller than most private yachts, but that tiny size made us incredibly difficult targets. Japanese gunners, trained to hit 1,000-ton destroyers, simply couldn't track something as small and fast as a PT boat maneuvering at high speed in darkness. The armament contradiction confused enemy commanders most of all. We carried 4 torpedoes that cost more than the entire boat. Each Mark 13 torpedo had a 1,000-pound warhead capable of breaking a destroyer's back. Japanese intelligence couldn't understand why we'd mount such expensive weapons on disposable platforms. Traditional thinking held that valuable weapons belonged on valuable ships. The idea that America would throw away boats and crews to deliver torpedoes seemed wasteful and illogical. But that apparent waste was strategic genius. A destroyer cost millions of dollars and took years to build. Losing one meant losing hundreds of trained sailors and irreplaceable industrial capacity. A PT boat cost less than $100,000 and could be built in 6 weeks. Losing one meant losing 12 men. Tragic, but replaceable. We could afford to trade PT boats for Japanese destroyers all day long and still come out ahead economically and strategically. The tactical contradiction was most revolutionary. Every navy since ancient times had emphasized formation fighting, ships operating in coordinated groups, supporting each other with overlapping fields of fire. PT boats threw that away completely. We attacked independently, each boat choosing its own approach, firing its own torpedoes, escaping on its own initiative. We couldn't support each other with gunfire because we were too spread out. We couldn't coordinate movements because we were moving too fast. We simply attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, creating chaos that prevented enemy forces from organizing effective responses. This independent action required trust that didn't exist in conventional naval operations. On a battleship, the captain gave orders and subordinates obeyed without question. On a PT boat, skipper gave general instructions, and crew members executed them however they saw fit. Dutch Vandenberg calculated firing solutions. Charlie Mendoza adjusted engine power. Paddy O'Brien armed torpedoes, all without waiting for specific orders. That decentralized decision-making made us incredibly responsive to changing conditions, but required crew members who could think independently under fire. The contradiction that defined PT boats was simple. We succeeded by breaking every rule that made navies function. We were small, fast, fragile, and completely unpredictable. The Japanese had prepared for American power and tradition. They got American innovation and chaos instead. After our first successful patrol in late June 1943, everything changed. We'd intercepted a small Japanese convoy northeast of New Georgia, sank one transport and damaged another, then disappeared into a tropical squall before enemy destroyers could retaliate. The convoy turned back, denying Japanese forces on New Georgia desperately needed ammunition and food. 2 weeks later, American Marines took the island with fewer casualties than expected because enemy defenders were starving and running low on ammunition. That single successful attack proved PT boats could do more than evacuate generals. We could actually affect battle outcomes. Admiral Halsey immediately requested more PT boats, more crews, more squadrons. The Navy, desperate for good news from the Pacific, approved everything. By August 1943, we had 6 squadrons operating throughout the Solomons, with more arriving monthly. The investigation into why PT boats succeeded where larger ships failed revealed uncomfortable truths about American naval doctrine. Our battleships and cruisers were designed for the wrong war. They were optimized for daytime fleet actions on open ocean, the kind of battles we'd imagined fighting since World War I. But the Pacific War was being fought at night in confined waters, filled with islands and reefs. Ships designed for long-range gunnery duels were useless when enemy vessels appeared suddenly at 3,000 yards in pitch darkness. PT boats succeeded because they were designed specifically for night combat in restricted waters. Our small size and shallow draft let us hide among islands and navigate channels where larger ships couldn't follow. Our speed let us close quickly, attack, and escape before enemy forces could respond. Our expendability meant commanders could authorize risky operations that would never be approved for valuable destroyers. The Japanese response evolved rapidly. After losing several convoys to PT boat attacks, they began assigning more destroyers as escorts. They developed coordinated search patterns using float planes to spot PT boats during daylight, so destroyers could track us after dark. They even modified some destroyers with shallow drafts, specifically designed to hunt us in coastal waters. But for every countermeasure they developed, we developed countermeasures. They added more escorts. We attacked in larger groups from multiple directions simultaneously. They used float planes to track us. We moved bases frequently and varied our patrol routes. They deployed special destroyer hunters. We learned to identify them by radar signature and avoid engagement unless we had overwhelming advantage. The arms race between PT boats and Japanese destroyers became a deadly game of chess played at 40 knots in the dark. Intelligence became crucial. We needed to know convoy schedules, routes, escort compositions. Coast watchers, hidden throughout the Solomons, radioed sightings of Japanese ships. Native scouts in canoes paddled out to report enemy movements. Submarine periscope observations provided details about convoy speeds and formations. Our operations expanded beyond simple torpedo attacks. We rescued downed pilots, evacuated wounded soldiers from isolated beaches, inserted reconnaissance teams behind enemy lines, attacked shore installations, mined harbor entrances, and generally made ourselves useful for any mission too dangerous or too crazy for conventional vessels. The versatility surprised everyone, including us. The casualty rate remained horrific. Of the 40 men who completed training with me, 14 were dead by December 1943. Another 6 were wounded seriously enough to be sent stateside. The boats were even more expendable. PT-164 survived 7 months of combat operations before taking a 5-inch shell through the engine room off Bougainville. We abandoned ship and watched her burn, swimming 3 miles to shore where friendly natives hid us until a PBY could evacuate us. But the consequences justified the costs. By autumn 1943, the Tokyo Express wasn't running regularly anymore. Japanese convoys required so many escorts that their destroyers couldn't patrol effectively. Supply lines to forward bases dried up. Enemy garrisons starved. American advances accelerated because Japanese forces couldn't sustain themselves. We'd proven small wooden boats could change the course of a war. 2 competing philosophies emerged about how PT boats should be employed, and the debate split senior commanders into opposing camps. The conflict wasn't just academic theory. It determined tactics that meant life or death for crews on patrol every night. The conservative approach, favored by traditional battleship admirals, viewed PT boats primarily as scouts and screening vessels. Under this doctrine, we'd patrol ahead of larger ships, detect enemy forces, report their positions, then withdraw while cruisers and destroyers engaged. PT boats would only attack if larger ships weren't available or if targets of opportunity appeared. The emphasis was on information gathering and fleet coordination, treating us as mobile radar platforms with torpedoes as secondary weapons. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner championed this approach. He argued that PT boats were too fragile for sustained combat, too lightly armed to challenge major warships, and too valuable as reconnaissance assets to risk indirect attacks. He wanted us integrated into traditional fleet operations, following established command structures and coordinating with other vessels. His vision was PT boats as auxiliary craft, supporting conventional naval forces. The aggressive approach, championed by commanders like Mac McPhersonson and Wild Jim Patterson, viewed PT boats as independent attack units whose primary mission was sinking enemy ships. Under this doctrine, we'd patrol known convoy routes, attack anything Japanese we encountered, and only report contacts if we couldn't engage successfully. The emphasis was on offensive action and autonomous decision-making, treating us as maritime guerrillas who lived by our own rules. Commander Paul Bunker, who pioneered PT boat tactics in the Philippines, became the most vocal advocate for aggressive employment. He'd survived the Japanese invasion and evacuation of Corregidor, learning through bitter experience that PT boats succeeded or failed based on crew initiative and tactical flexibility. He argued that treating PT boats like conventional vessels wasted their primary advantages: speed, surprise, and unpredictability. The debate came to a head in August 1943 during planning for operations around Vella Lavella. Admiral Turner wanted PT squadrons assigned to screen the invasion fleet, staying in designated patrol zones and reporting enemy contacts to fleet commanders who would coordinate responses. Commander Bunker wanted PT boats released to hunt independently, attacking anything moving through the channels without waiting for permission. McPherson made the case that settled the argument. He pointed out that by the time PT boats detected enemy forces, reported contacts, received orders, and maneuvered into attack position, Japanese convoys would already be past. The 5-time delay between detection and authorization killed any tactical advantage we possessed. Our speed only mattered if we could use it immediately without waiting for fleet coordination. He proposed a compromise. PT boats would patrol assigned zones, but had authority to attack any enemy vessels encountered without requesting permission. We'd report contacts before attacking when time allowed, but mission accomplishment took priority over communication protocols. Skippers could make tactical decisions based on immediate conditions, rather than waiting for orders from commanders miles away who couldn't see what we were seeing. The hybrid approach worked brilliantly. We provided early warning when enemy forces approached, giving fleet commanders time to position larger ships, but we also attacked immediately when opportunities appeared, disrupting enemy operations before they could complete their missions. The flexibility let us adapt tactics to each situation, rather than following rigid doctrine that might be inappropriate for actual conditions. The aggressive doctrine gradually won out as successful operations proved its effectiveness. By late 1943, PT boats operated almost entirely independently, coordinating with fleet operations only when necessary. We became the Navy's Special Operations Force before that term existed, trusted to make our own decisions and accomplish our own missions without constant supervision. The debate between conservative and aggressive employment wasn't really about tactics. It was about whether the Navy could adapt to revolutionary warfare or remain locked in traditional thinking. PT boats forced that adaptation, proving that small units with tactical flexibility could accomplish things that large formations with rigid command structures couldn't. The Japanese never understood what hit them because they expected us to fight like conventional naval forces. We didn't. We fought like pirates with torpedoes, and that made all the difference. The turning point came on the night of October 7th, 1943, off the coast of Chorzul. What started as a routine patrol revealed something that would change how both sides fought the night war in the Solomon Islands. We were running dark at 15 knots. 3 boats in loose formation, separated by half a mile, when Dutch Vandenberg picked up unusual radar contacts moving south through Blackett Strait. The signatures didn't match any known Japanese formation. 6 vessels in 2 groups, moving at high speed, but making frequent course changes. Japanese convoys ran straight and fast to minimize exposure time. These contacts were maneuvering like they were hunting something. Instead of attacking immediately, he ordered us to shadow the contacts while trying to identify them. We shut down to quiet idle, letting the enemy formation pass, then followed at a distance. What we discovered was terrifying. 6 vessels working in coordinated pairs. 2 destroyers equipped with searchlights and shallow draft modifications, 2 submarine chasers with depth charges modified for surface use, and 2 armed barges mounting heavy machine guns. They weren't escorting convoys. They were hunting us specifically, using tactics we'd never seen before. The destroyers would sweep channels with searchlights, while submarine chasers positioned themselves to cut off escape routes. If they spotted a PT boat, the destroyers would illuminate the target, while barges moved in close with machine guns to disable engines. The depth charges weren't for submarines. They were set for shallow detonation to create massive water columns that could swamp or capsize small boats. We watched for 3 hours as they systematically searched Blackett Strait, moving in precise patterns that covered every possible hiding spot. They knew our tactics, our patrol routes, our base locations. Somewhere, somehow, the Japanese had analyzed enough PT boat operations to develop countermeasures that could neutralize our primary advantages. The implications were staggering. If the Japanese could hunt us effectively, the night war would swing back in their favor. PT boats only worked because we controlled when and where we engaged. If enemy forces could force us into defensive positions, our speed and surprise became irrelevant. We'd be trapped, hunted, destroyed systematically. Mac called a squadron meeting the next morning. Every skipper attended, and the mood was grim. If the Japanese deployed hunter groups throughout the Solomons, PT boat operations might become impossible. We needed new tactics immediately or face catastrophic losses. Charlie Mendoza, our motor machinist mate, suggested we do to the hunters what they were doing to us. Reverse the roles and make them the hunted. Instead of avoiding hunter groups, we'd specifically target them. PT boats would coordinate attacks on the hunters while they were searching for us, eliminating the threat before it eliminated us. The idea was insane and brilliant. Hunt the hunters. Attack forces specifically designed to kill us. But the alternative was abandoning night operations and letting the Japanese reclaim control of the darkness. We developed Operation Switchblade. When radar detected hunter groups, all available PT boats would converge from different directions, attack simultaneously from multiple angles, then scatter before enemy forces could coordinate responses. We'd use their search patterns against them, waiting until they were spread out and vulnerable before striking. The first test came 4 nights later when we detected another hunter group off Vella Lavella. 7 PT boats attacked from 5 directions within 30 seconds. We sank 1 destroyer, damaged a submarine chaser, and scattered the formation. The surviving enemy vessels withdrew, abandoning their search. The Japanese tried hunting PT boats for another month before giving up. Their losses became unsustainable. Destroyers assigned to hunter groups weren't escorting convoys, which meant convoys became more vulnerable. The cure was worse than the disease. By November 1943, the Japanese reverted to heavily escorted convoys instead of dedicated hunter groups. We'd won the tactical arms race. But the victory revealed a deeper truth. The enemy was learning and adapting just as we were. The night war would remain fluid and deadly because both sides kept innovating. The turning point wasn't that we defeated hunter groups. The turning point was realizing we couldn't rely on surprise alone. The Japanese would keep developing countermeasures, and we'd have to keep adapting faster than they could deploy new tactics. The war of innovation would determine who controlled the night. The success of PT boats in the Solomon Islands rippled far beyond the immediate tactical victories. By late 1943, every major navy was re-evaluating its doctrine about small attack craft and asymmetric warfare. What we'd proven in the South Pacific challenged assumptions that had governed naval thinking for centuries. The strategic implication was obvious. Small, cheap, expendable platforms could challenge large, expensive, supposedly invulnerable warships if employed correctly. This overturned fundamental calculations about naval supremacy. A battleship costing $50 million and requiring 3 years to build could be threatened by a dozen PT boats, costing $1 million total and built in 6 weeks. The economic math favored small attack craft overwhelmingly. The British immediately expanded their motor torpedo boat program, building dozens of vessels for operations in the Mediterranean and English Channel. Soviet naval forces requested technical assistance to develop their own fast attack craft for Baltic and Black Sea operations. Even the Germans, who'd pioneered E-boat tactics years earlier, studied American PT boat operations to improve their own doctrine. The Japanese response revealed how seriously they took the threat. Documents captured later showed they diverted significant resources to developing countermeasures. They modified destroyer designs specifically for anti-PT boat operations. They created new training programs, focusing on night combat against small, fast targets. They even attempted to build their own PT boat force using captured American vessels as models. But the deepest implication wasn't military, it was philosophical. PT boats proved that innovation mattered more than tradition, that tactical flexibility trumped rigid doctrine, that courage and initiative could overcome material disadvantage. This was deeply American thinking applied to naval warfare. We'd taken British and European concepts, added American engineering and aggressive tactics, and created something revolutionary. The impact extended to amphibious operations planning. When planners began designing the Normandy invasion in late 1943, they included PT boats specifically to counter German E-boats expected to attack invasion fleets. The lessons learned in the Solomons about coordination between small attack craft and large amphibious forces proved invaluable during D-Day operations. PT boat doctrine influenced post-war naval development dramatically. The concept evolved into guided missile patrol boats, then fast attack craft armed with modern weapons. Every navy maintaining coastal defense forces today operates vessels directly descended from World War II PT boats. The Israeli Navy's successful use of fast attack craft in the 1967 and 1973 wars came from studying American PT boat tactics. The psychological implications were equally important. American sailors learned they could take initiative without waiting for orders. That tactical flexibility mattered more than strict obedience to doctrine. That small units could accomplish things large formations couldn't. This decentralized command philosophy influenced American military thinking for generations. The industrial implications revolutionized American shipbuilding. PT boats proved that standardized, rapidly produced vessels could be militarily effective. The same principles applied later to Liberty ships, destroyer escorts, and aircraft carriers built in record time. American industrial capacity won World War II partly because we learned to build good enough ships fast rather than perfect ships slowly. The human implications hit home decades later. PT boat veterans went into business, education, politics. We'd learned that innovation beats tradition, that small teams with clear missions outperform large bureaucracies, that calculated risks produce better results than cautious conservatism. Those lessons shaped post-war America in ways never measured but deeply felt. Perhaps the most profound implication was proving that free people fighting for freedom could innovate faster than authoritarian systems. The Japanese military was professionally competent, tactically skilled, and strategically focused. But they couldn't adapt as quickly as American forces because their rigid hierarchy discouraged independent thinking. PT boat crews made tactical decisions in seconds that would have required hours of approval in Japanese command structures. The gap between American innovation and Japanese adaptation widened throughout the war. By 1945, we'd developed new tactics, new weapons, new strategies, faster than enemy forces could counter them. That pace of innovation came directly from the decentralized decision-making proven effective by PT boat operations. The implications of 3 wooden boats attacking a convoy off Vella Lavella in July 1943 echoed through decades of military history and shaped the modern world in ways we never imagined while trying not to die in the darkness. Living on a PT boat meant knowing everything about your 11 crewmates in ways that would be impossible on larger ships. On a destroyer with 300 men, you might never learn the names of sailors from different divisions. On a PT boat with 12 men sharing 80 feet of cramped quarters, you knew who snored, who had nightmares, who wrote letters home every night, who cracked under pressure, who could be trusted when things went to hell. Dutch Vandenberg, our executive officer, was a Yale mathematics professor who could calculate torpedo firing solutions faster than most men could work a slide rule. But he couldn't tie a decent bowline to save his life, so I taught him sailor's knots during quiet watches. He taught me celestial navigation theory that transformed my practical knowledge into real understanding. We became friends despite different backgrounds because survival required trusting each other completely. Charlie Mendoza, our chief motor machinist mate, had been building racing engines in Los Angeles before the war. He could make our temperamental Packards purr like kittens or roar like lions, depending on what we needed. But he had panic attacks during extended combat, hyperventilating until someone grabbed his shoulders and talked him through it. We all knew this. We all covered for him when it happened, because once the panic passed, he was the best engineer in the squadron. Paddy O'Brien, our torpedo man, treated his Mark 13 torpedoes better than most men treated their wives. He'd spend hours polishing bronze propellers, adjusting depth settings, sweet-talking those mechanical fish like they were sentient. The rest of us mocked him mercilessly. But when torpedoes launched true and ran straight, we silently thanked whatever gods Paddy believed in for his obsessive care. Sparks Patterson, our radio man, came from submarine service where he'd learned to operate radios in absolute silence. He could interpret Morse code faster than most people could read printed text, picking signals out of static that nobody else heard. But he was terrified of open water, which seemed strange for a submariner until we learned he'd survived a depth charge attack that killed most of his previous crew. He never talked about it, but sometimes he'd wake up screaming about water rushing into compartments. The intimacy created bonds that lasted lifetimes. My PT boat reunions decades after the war felt like family gatherings, because that's what we were, a family forged in combat. We'd seen each other at our worst, terrified, exhausted, broken. We'd also seen each other at our best, courageous, competent, determined. That shared knowledge created trust deeper than blood relations. The food on PT boats deserves mention. We lived on K-rations, Spam, powdered eggs, and whatever we could trade from larger ships. Fresh water was precious, rationed for drinking only. We washed in seawater, which left salt crystals that chafed and burned. Coffee, black and strong enough to float a wrench, was our lifeblood. Some crews became creative, fishing with hand grenades or trading torpedo alcohol to base personnel for real food. The physical conditions were brutal. Salt water corroded everything. Tropical heat rotted wood and fabric. High-speed operations stressed every component to breaking points. We spent more time maintaining our boat than fighting in it. Every man became a mechanic, carpenter, and electrician by necessity. A PT boat with engine failure in enemy waters was a death trap. The psychological toll marked us permanently. Living constantly on edge, knowing any patrol could be your last, watching friends die in horrific ways. Some men cracked, requesting transfers even though it meant being labeled cowards. Others became addicted to adrenaline, volunteering for increasingly dangerous missions. Most of us just endured, finding ways to cope with fear that never really went away. The humor that developed was dark but necessary. We named our boats Sudden Death, Hell's Angels, Grim Reaper. We painted cartoon characters on torpedoes. Donald Duck riding missiles was popular. We made up songs about sinking Japanese ships. The more gruesome, the better. It was psychological armor, making the unbearable bearable. The humanity of PT boat service came down to simple truth. We were mostly kids playing with deadly toys in a war that killed millions. We made mistakes that should have killed us, took risks that make me shudder in retrospect. But we also loved each other in ways civilians never understand. Brothers bonded by shared danger and absolute trust. That brotherhood is what I remember most. 60 years later, not the battles or victories, but the men who fought beside me in wooden boats against impossible odds. The truth about PT boats, the truth nobody wanted to acknowledge during the war, and many veterans still refuse to accept, is that we weren't wonder weapons. We were dangerous, uncomfortable, frighteningly fragile craft that killed many of the men who crewed them. The casualty rate exceeded 50%, not because we were unlucky, but because the mission was fundamentally suicidal. Attack steel warships with wooden boats and hope speed compensated for complete lack of armor protection. The revelation I came to years after the war, sitting in my study surrounded by faded photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, was that PT boats succeeded despite their limitations, not because of any inherent superiority. We won because Japanese forces expected conventional warfare and got chaos instead. We won because American industrial capacity could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. We won because we were expendable and accepted that reality. The uncomfortable truth was that for every successful attack, we had 10 patrols where nothing happened. For every dramatic torpedo launch, we had 100 hours of maintenance, boring transit, and mind-numbing waiting. The heroic narrative emphasized action and combat, but the reality was grinding, dangerous work punctuated by occasional moments of terror. Another revelation came from studying Japanese war records after the conflict ended. They knew about PT boats earlier than we realized and developed countermeasures faster than we acknowledged. Their failure to neutralize us wasn't because our tactics were brilliant. It was because they couldn't allocate enough resources to hunting small boats while simultaneously defending against American submarines, aircraft, and major fleet units. We succeeded partly because the enemy had bigger problems to worry about. The strategic revelation was perhaps most important. PT boats didn't win the Pacific War. Submarines, aircraft carriers, and American industrial capacity won the war. PT boats contributed, sometimes significantly, but they were never decisive. The Solomon Islands campaign would have succeeded eventually even without PT boats, just more slowly and expensively. Our contribution was accelerating American advances and reducing casualties, which mattered enormously to the boys who didn't die because we sank enemy supply ships. But we weren't the war-winning weapon propaganda suggested. The personal revelation came harder. For years, I believed we were heroes, brave men doing extraordinary things. The truth was more complicated. We were volunteers, who chose dangerous duty, yes, but we were also young men seeking adventure, running from peacetime limitations, looking for purpose and meaning. Some of us were heroes. Some were just survivors who got lucky. Most were ordinary people, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, who did what we had to do because the alternative was letting our friends down. The technological revelation was equally sobering. PT boats represented peak development for wooden fast attack craft, but they were already obsolete by 1944. Improved radar made darkness less of an advantage. Better Japanese tactics reduced our surprise factor. Heavier enemy defenses made attacks more costly. By war's end, the Navy was already designing successor vessels with metal hulls, better weapons, and modern electronics. The PT boat's revolutionary moment lasted barely 2 years before technology moved on. But perhaps the most profound revelation was understanding what we actually proved. PT boats demonstrated that American innovation, courage, and willingness to take risks could overcome any obstacle. We showed that free people fighting for freedom could outthink, out-adapt, and out-fight authoritarian systems despite material disadvantages. We proved that tactical flexibility and decentralized decision-making produced better results than rigid doctrine and centralized control. That revelation, that American approach to problem-solving could defeat enemies with better equipment and more experience, became the template for post-war American military success. Not overwhelming force, though we had that, not superior technology, though we developed that, but rather innovation, adaptability, and willingness to try new approaches when conventional methods failed. The final revelation, the one I'm still processing decades later, is that our sacrifice meant something. We proved concepts that influenced naval warfare for generations. We saved American lives by disrupting enemy supply lines. We contributed to victory in ways large and small. Whether that justifies the costs, the men who died, the physical and psychological scars we carry, I still don't know. But I know we tried our best, fought with courage, and never quit, even when the odds seemed impossible. For young men far from home in a war we didn't start, maybe that's enough. I'm writing this in autumn of 2009, sitting in my study in suburban Maryland, surrounded by memories of a war that ended 64 years ago. On the wall hangs a photograph of PT 164's crew, taken in July 1943, 23 young men grinning at the camera like we'd live forever. Of those 23 faces, 7 are dead, killed in various actions throughout the war. 6 more died in the decades since, taken by age and illness. 10 of us remain scattered across the country, staying in touch through phone calls and occasional reunions. Last month, I attended our Squadron reunion in Charleston. Only 14 veterans showed up, down from 40 the previous year. We sat around hotel conference rooms telling the same stories we've told for decades, embellishing details, correcting each other's memories, laughing at jokes that civilians wouldn't understand. Dutch Vandenberg is still sharp at 92, calculating mathematical problems for fun. Charlie Mendoza runs a classic car restoration business in California, still making engines sing. Paddy O'Brien never married. Says no woman could compete with those Mark 13 torpedoes. We're old men now, but when we get together, we become young again, if only in memory. People ask me what I want them to remember about PT boats and the men who crewed them. I tell them to remember we were ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things because the moment demanded it. We weren't supermen or heroes in the traditional sense. We were kids from farms and cities, factories and colleges who volunteered for dangerous duty and tried our best not to let each other down. Remember that we fought at night, because that's when America needed us most. We attacked from darkness, not because we were cowards hiding from daylight battle, but because darkness was where we had advantage. The Japanese owned the night when we arrived in the Solomons. We took it from them through courage, innovation, and sheer determination. Remember that we proved American ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. The Japanese had better torpedoes, better trained crews, decades of preparation. We had wooden boats built in weeks and crews trained in months. But we adapted faster, innovated constantly, and never stopped trying to find better ways to fight. That American approach to problem-solving, that willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and try new methods, won the Pacific War as surely as industrial capacity and military power. Remember that size doesn't determine victory. We were small boats taking on warships 20 times our displacement. We were small crews, challenging enemy forces, hundreds strong. We were small part of a massive war effort. But small doesn't mean insignificant. Small can be agile, fast, flexible, and deadly when used correctly. Most importantly, remember the cost. The veterans who survived are celebrated, and rightfully so. But remember also the ones who didn't come home. The crews lost in night actions nobody witnessed. The men burned alive when gasoline tanks exploded. The sailors drowned in tropical waters far from home. They paid the price for proving that PT boats could work. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals who gave everything. The legacy of PT boats lives on in modern naval forces. Every fast attack craft, every special operations vessel, every boat designed to strike quickly and disappear carries DNA from those original Mosquito boats. The sailors who crew them probably don't know about nights off Vella Lavella or the terror we brought to Japanese convoys. But they're our spiritual descendants, carrying on traditions of speed, surprise, and audacity. As I finish this account, I can still hear those Packard engines roaring in the night. I can still feel Solomon seawater spray on my face, still smell cordite and diesel fumes. Most of all, I can still feel the pride of being part of something revolutionary, something that changed naval warfare forever. We were boys who became men in wooden boats, fighting a war we didn't start, but were determined to finish. We emerged from darkness, struck without warning, and disappeared before the enemy could respond. The Japanese were stunned by America's secret PT boats because we represented everything they didn't expect: innovation, courage, and the willingness to challenge their empire with nothing but speed and torpedoes. We were small, fast, and deadly. We were the Mosquito fleet that helped bring down an empire, one torpedo at a time.